There are builders who stay rooted in one skyline. There are raiders who become the story through force of personality. And then there's Richard Rainwater, a man who moved through oil, hospitals, natural gas, real estate, entertainment, and finance with a style that felt almost invisible until the moment that the numbers turned. He did not look like the loudest titan of the era. He looked more like the guy studying the room while everyone else was reacting to the headline. One early television introduction captured the scale of his run in a way that still works beautifully today.
Now, before we meet tonight's special guest, let's see how he has conquered empires ranging from oil rigs to real estate investment trusts to hospitals to health spas as he built the reign of Rainwater. It all began with two friends at Stanford Business School in the late 60s. Richard Rainwater, who had grown up in Fort Worth's small but tight-knit Lebanese community, though his last name reflects another part of his ancestry, Cherokee Indian, and Sid Bass, one of the heirs to a Fort Worth family oil fortune that then totaled about $50 million.
That opening gets to the heart of the story, but here's something almost nobody mentions about Rainwater. He virtually never gave interviews. The profiles that existed were assembled from associates, former partners, and people whose deals he touched. He almost never spoke directly, and yet his reputation preceded every deal he made. Investors lined up, operators called him, institutional capital followed. He generated leverage through absence. The less he said publicly, the more the narrative filled in around him. And there's one quote from his major television appearance in 1997 that captured his entire method in a single sentence. Quote, "Your investment decisions ought to be made off the front page of the paper rather than the business section." He meant it precisely. When something makes the front page, all private remedies have already failed. The price is at the floor. Everyone who wanted out is already gone. And that is when Richard Rainwater started making calls. Rainwater belonged to the rare class of American financiers who could step into a broken situation, see the one angle everyone else had missed, find the operator who could carry the load, and then structure the terms so that the deal worked out for him. He also left behind a line that works for the thesis of the whole story. You don't know anything. That's your superpower. Start with a blank page and ask, where must money go and how can I help? He meant it as discipline. He wanted to begin with the first principles and fresh eyes. I'm Nico Ludwig, founder of Collateral Partners, the financial storytelling firm. A big special thank you to Rami Adi of Rainmakers Podcast for help researching this episode. I highly recommend you check out his podcast for more on Richard Rainwater. And if you've seen our episodes on Trammell Crow, Sam Zell, or Kurt Kerkorian, you know what we're trying to do with this series. We study outsized careers to find the operating principle that kept showing up when stakes were the highest. With Richard Rainwater, that principle is simple. Informational edge becomes extraordinary when it is paired with timing, narrative, and aligned incentives. Rainwater kept running the same play. He made himself the person that everybody called. The deal flow became intelligence. That intelligence gave him conviction when an industry was under stress. Then he paired capital with the right operator, wrote terms that protected his downside, and waited for sentiment to catch up. There's also a pattern that all of our research identified that runs through every major deal he ever made. He always made a small learning investment before going large. He bought AMI shares before funding Columbia. He did Blocker before building Unesco. He ran the Bass Investment LP with Milken before doing Disney. Every big move was preceded by a smaller one that taught him where the bodies were buried and who the best operator in the room was. Chapter 1, The Fort Worth Outsider. The timeline here is from 1944 to 1968. Richard Rainwater was born in Fort Worth, Texas in 1944, the son of a wholesale dry goods merchant, which placed him close enough to ambition to study it and far enough from dynasty to understand that money and status were never the same thing. He did not arrive as a natural heir to Texas oil wealth. He arrived as an observer. As a boy, his mother told him to deliver newspapers to earn money. Instead, he hired 3 kids at 5 cents each to do the route, while he collected 10 cents per delivery. He sat in a bench drinking Coke while they worked the neighborhood. He was keeping the margin. He was already thinking about spread, structure, and who had to do the labor versus who got to keep the economics. That is a famous anecdote because it compresses the adult Rainwater into childhood form. At the University of Texas, he studied math and physics. At Stanford Business School, he added finance and access. Stanford mattered for two reasons. One, it sharpened his analytical instincts, and two, it placed him inside what would be later called the greatest MBA class ever assembled. The Stanford class of 1968 included Reese Duca, who went on to found IGSB, John Scully, who eventually ran SPO Partners, Lorenzo Zambrano, who built Cemex into a global cement empire, Jim Cronover of McKinsey, Patrick Gross of AMS, and Gering Stadlin, among others. They kept in contact across the decades, and they would eventually raise over $100 million for Stanford's business school. Rainwater himself issued a challenge to the class in 2007 to raise $50 million, committing to match it dollar for dollar if they reached the target. That network was structural. These were peers who could cross-reference deals, validate operators, and refer talent to each other for the rest of their working lives. And one of their classmates was Sid Bass. He was heir to the Fort Worth oil fortune totaling over $50 million. Rainwater and Sid were not close at Stanford. They barely knew each other, but Sid noticed something, and it was that Rainwater taught an applied math workshop for his classmates and displayed an unusual quality. He had common sense paired with analytical rigor. When Sid eventually needed someone to manage their family's capital, Rainwater came to mind specifically because he was young, fearless, and not yet scarred by market losses. A Harvard Business School source later captured the way Rainwater thought about hidden potential, saying, quote, "Having the time and aspiration to think is very, very valuable," he said. "The world is full of people who don't understand how powerful or gifted they are because they are buried in an organization that doesn't allow them to be. If it looks like you'll always be also ran, you should look around because you are probably not an also ran. You are probably gifted." That quote captured what he was hunting for from the start. He looked at people the way he later looked at companies. A great asset inside the wrong structure can look ordinary. A gifted person inside the wrong system can look invisible. And the key inside of this chapter is that Rainwater's first edge was observational. Before he had his own capital, he had an outsider's eye for structure, incentives, and hidden value. Chapter 2, The Money-Losing Apprenticeship. The timeline here is from 1968 until 1972. After Stanford, Rainwater joined Goldman Sachs in Dallas as an institutional salesman. But he was almost restless immediately. The work gave him polish, but it did not give him ownership. And that changed when Sid Bass called him from Fort Worth to help manage his family's capital. Sid had a specific philosophy about why he wanted someone young. This story maps almost exactly onto something Stanley Druckenmiller would later describe about his own career. Getting promoted at 23 because his boss told him, "You're too dumb, too young, and too inexperienced not to charge." The previous generations had scars. They couldn't pull the trigger. Sid needed someone who could. On paper, the Bass job looked like a golden ticket. In practice, it became a trial by fire. In the first 2 years, Rainwater invested $5 million of Bass's money across a range of early ventures. Devices that helped children take tests in schools, only to find schools had no money to buy them, restaurant operators who had never been in the restaurant business, the classic mistakes that could be made. By 1972, he had ulcers. He was 27 years old and had lost all the money.
What we did was foolish. What we did were things that should have never been done. It wasn't a matter that it was a studied approach to like building a plane that was going to fly that you just barely missed what was the proper aerodynamics of a wing. I mean, we didn't put wings on the plane.
Genuinely baffled that he hadn't been fired, Rainwater asked Sid's father, Perry Bass, why he was still around. Perry replied, quote, "I couldn't afford to let you go anywhere else after having given you such a high-class, expensive education." That answer kept him in the room. What he did with the room is a whole different story. He spent that year studying the way that he'd studied physics and math. If you can see a recurring phenomenon, you can usually backtrack to a set of common inputs that created the common output. He went and found those inputs. He set up the meetings with 20 of the best investors of the era: Warren Buffett, Phil Fisher, Benjamin Graham, David Dodd, and a figure most people overlooked, Charles Allen Jr. of Allen & Co. Buffett and Fisher taught him the value investing promising, but Allen was the real revelation. Allen had built his firm as a hybrid merchant bank and investment vehicle. He presented an investment bank to attract deal flow, then invested as a principal in the deals that came through. He was quick to make a yes or no decision, which made him the first call for brokers and finders. He employed other Wall Street firms to handle transactions rather than competing with them, which created a network of reciprocal favors. He never had outside partners other than his siblings and his best paid employees. Rainwater was 15% Buffett and 85% Charlie Allen. He rebuilt the Bass Brothers enterprises from the ground up on that template. The lesson from the early failure wasn't be more careful. It was build the right structure first and then let the structure do the work. The first test of that new approach was David Dunn. Dunn had been the youngest partner in the history of J.W. Whitney, one of the earliest venture capital funds in the country. He had sourced 5 of the firm's 9 venture deals in 1968 and 1969 and was ready to go strike out on his own with a $20 million debut fund. But the market crashed in 1970, banks backed out, no one would finance high-risk ventures, so Rainwater took a meeting with Dunn and walked him through the Bass family investments, early deals, asking for Dunn's assessment. Dunn told him to his face, quote, "This is Richard and Sid's amateur hour. You guys honestly don't know what you're doing." Richard didn't flinch. He respected it. He called Dunn later when Dunn had given up on the banks. Quote, "The only reason why we didn't invest was that we didn't want to merely be a bit player in a larger organization. We'd be interested in discussing the possibility of providing all of the necessary funding." They struck a deal. Bass and Rainwater provided $8 million to launch Idanta Partners in 1971, a full year before Sequoia Capital or Kleiner Perkins started. Idanta turned that $8 million into $200 million by 1981, seeding 2 of the biggest IPOs of the decade in Prime Computers and iOmega. That was the new method in action. Find the best operator in a field that nobody wants to fund, be the sole capital partner, and get the terms that concentration earns. The key insight here: Rainwater's method was born from embarrassment. He stopped chasing clever deals and started building a framework that could survive reality. There's 2 reasons why I made this film. The first is I love telling financial stories, and the second is I want to tell yours. I'm the founder of Collateral Partners. We help investment firms and operating businesses close the gap between who they actually are and how they're perceived. We have finance people who understand your business and designers who make you look institutional, and that combination doesn't exist anywhere else. So if you're raising capital, closing clients, or recruiting talent, and you're tired of competitors who just present themselves better, click the link below. Let's get on a call and audit your materials versus your leading competitors, and let's close the gap. Chapter 3, Inside the Bass Machine. The timeline here is from 1970 and then 1983. Once Rainwater shifted from improvisation to pattern recognition, the Bass years became something more powerful than a rich family office. They became an intelligence network. He structured 4 parallel investment operations: a venture capital firm through Idanta with David Dunn, real estate through Bass Realty under David G. Marshall, who built a $2 billion portfolio, including Pier 39 in San Francisco, a Jack Nicklaus golf development in Scottsdale, and Denver Place, a 2.5 million square foot mixed-use complex in Colorado. Public equities through Texas Partners with John Scully, his former Stanford classmate, who later founded the legendary SPO Partners. And 4, an arbitrage desk by Tommy Taylor from Kidder Peabody. Each of these were a learning position as much as an investment position. The people running them were briefing Rainwater in every industry they touched. The physical operation looked unusual. Multiple conference rooms filled with people waiting to present. Rainwater walking from room to room like a physician, writing on whiteboards while people pitched, giving quick yes or no decisions, then moving to the next room. He might hear 100 to 200 pitches in a single day. Institutional investor described his setup with unusual clarity, saying, quote, "You'll find names of managers of companies Rainwater had invested in, including Walt Disney CEO Michael Eisner and President Frank Wells, real estate developer and former Dallas Cowboy Roger Staubach, and hospital operator Thomas Frist, along with people Rainwater has met while researching deals, like Lucas, Buffett, Hollywood agent Michael Ovitz, and entertainment lawyer Alan Grubman. At one time, Rainwater's fellow investors included Michael Milken. Then it goes even further, quote, "The people connections are only part of the story. Rainwater is also an idea man. He has the ability to size up an investment situation faster than you could say Yellow Rose of Texas, and a knack for being among the first to identify out-of-favor investments that will eventually turn to favor. Most pitches were no, but every no came with a data point. By the time a sector made the front page, Rainwater already knew the best assets and who the best operators were inside of them. One early proof of the method, their investment in Sperry and Hutchison stamps. The stamps business was in a structural decline. The stock reflected it, but Rainwater's team recognized that the company held roughly $200 million in float from unredeemed stamps, capital being deployed into real estate and insurance. They built a position of 20% to 36.3% and sold when Baldwin United acquired the company in 1981. Annual return was 79%. The 1980s added a new dimension, the junk bond era in Michael Milken. Rainwater had been meeting with Milken since the 1970s on real estate deals. When he recognized that Milken's Drexel Burnham was pioneering a new kind of leveraged finance, he did what he always did. He found the best person in the emerging field and made them his partner. They created the Bass Investment Limited Partnership, $30 million from Bass, $30 million from Drexel employees, and $540 million from Equitable Life Insurance, which Rainwater recruited as the institutional anchor, a $600 million pool that did leverage buyouts across Perkins family restaurants, G-Tech, a slot machine operator, and a fat processing plant called Darling, Delaware, among others. The fund returned 100% per year to the general partner for the 6 years it ran and 30% annually to Equitable Life. That fund was Rainwater's training ground for the leveraged deal structure. He learned from the Milken and Drexel team about how to use debt as architecture. He applied that directly to what came next. A 1984 Fortune cover story described the Bass Empire's mystique, saying, quote, "They worked diligently at covering their tracks by investing through a Byzantine network of friends, partners, family-controlled companies, and trusts, and even a ceramic store in New Mexico. But a fortune in the billions is getting hard to hide. Their empire spawned in oil and gas pools in the 1930s, now emanates from the top 7 floors of a futuristic glass office building in Fort Worth." He learned the value of mystique. He learned how scale can be partly real and partly perceived, and how that perception itself attracts better opportunities. By the time he left, he had taken the Bass family from $50 million to $5 billion in 16 years, a compounded annual return of roughly 35%. The key insight here: the Bass years taught Rainwater that information itself is leverage. Capital mattered, but access, reputation, and constant deal flow mattered just as much. Chapter 4, Disney and the Proof of Concept. The timeline here is from 1984 to 1986. Every major investor has a deal that turns philosophy into physical proof. For Rainwater, Disney was that deal. The opportunity arrived from an unexpected direction. A movie producer named Jonathan Taplin first came to Rainwater pitching a small Hollywood studio called Lionsgate. Not the company we know today, but a different, much smaller operation that only needed about $100,000. Rainwater cut him off, saying, "We don't have time for $5 million deals. Come back when you've got something bigger." Taplin came back with Disney. The company was famous, valuable, and undermanaged enough to matter. Walt Disney's son-in-law, Ron Miller, had taken charge in 1983. He was a former Los Angeles Rams player with no operating background, who was using the main studio lots to play poker at 2 p.m. Box office failures like Bonderman, Night Crossing, and Popeye had destroyed institutional confidence. Corporate raider Saul Steinberg, a Milken client, was circling with plans to acquire a controlling stake and break the company apart, selling the studio, the real estate, and the parks to separate buyers. Rainwater read the headlines as a price signal and started making calls. His analysis was precise. The Disney parks had not raised ticket prices in years, not even keeping pace with inflation. A $1 increase on the $18 day pass would generate generate $31 million in additional profits. The real estate around the Disney World was massively underdeveloped. The studio was mismanaged, but the brand was intact. He explained his operating philosophy directly, saying, quote, "My favorite securities are not only undervalued, but those of undermanaged companies. I don't invest in terribly managed companies. In terribly managed companies, you have guys who are doing the absolute wrong things. They're pushing it off the cliff. I don't have enough time or energy to involve myself in things like that." Disney was an undermanaged company, not a terribly managed company. The deal structure was elegant. The Bass brothers owned Arvida, a Florida land development company, sometimes called Florida's answer to the Irvine Company, bought for roughly $20 million. Rainwater proposed swapping Arvida into Disney in exchange for roughly $200 million in Disney stock. The Bass family would simultaneously acquire enough of a stake to block Steinberg's rig. Roy Watson, a Disney board member, was instrumental in accepting the deal. Watson had left the Irvine Company years earlier because he had gotten control to develop the land he always wanted. Arvida gave him that chance, a massive Florida land position he could finally develop properly. Rainwater had been in contact with the Watsons since the 1970s. This was a decade of relationship paying off in a single transaction. But the deal structure was only half of it. Rainwater then turned to the first question he always asked: who was the right operator? He spent 3 days with George Lucas, who pointed him towards Michael Eisner. He called the best people in entertainment industry to test the thesis and landed on Eisner and Frank Wells as the management team. He pushed the Disney board to install them. His involvement in deciding who the management should be was total. After Rainwater and the Basses bought out a second-rater, Irwin Jacobs, the Bass family emerged as the largest shareholder in Disney with a 25% stake in 1984. The Arvida investment had cost roughly $20 million in cash, and the Disney position grew to over $2.5 billion. One account sums up his style with a line worth holding on to. Quote, "Rainwater could make these contrarian bets while trying to reap the most reward he could without as little capital of his own down as he could." It sounds crazy. How would someone not only invest in industries when they are in distress, lack liquidity, but at the same time structure a deal for himself where he can get the precious capital that many companies needed while convincing his partners to give him the lion's share for doing so? It is because he understood that narrative is leverage. Disney made the abstract idea concrete. It showed that Rainwater's framework could work at enormous scale. And once that happened, people stopped seeing him as the clever man inside the Bass orbit. He was becoming a capital allocator with his own gravity. The key insight here was that Disney proved that Rainwater's best deals began when reputation, public disappointment, and fixable management problems collided. Chapter 5, Stepping Out on His Own. The timeline here is from 1986 to 1989. When Rainwater left the Bass organization in 1986, the Bass family split their assets amongst the four brothers. Robert Bass took the investment team Rainwater had assembled and set up his own operation, hiring David Bonderman as his version of Rainwater. That meant Rainwater was starting over. No team, no underlying oil business covering overhead. Every cent he had was now at risk. He took roughly $175 million from his Bass years and founded Rainwater Inc. in the same Fort Worth tower. Same building, no payroll, no hierarchy, no memos, just a loose confederation of deal professionals. He later described what it took to build a successful investment business using 3 words: capital, connections, and culture. For culture, he changed his approach entirely. Instead of backing established investors who needed money, he now hired talented young people who didn't know yet what they didn't know. He gave them his offices. He gave them access to deal flow. He did not give them salary though. Ken Hirsch, who would later build NGP into a $20 billion energy private equity firm, described the physical setup in remarkable detail, saying, quote, "If I didn't know better, I would have thought it was a semiconductor clean room or some sort of medical lab. Each office had a glass wall facing out to the core of the floor, but the other 3 walls were a solid white covered in slick magnetic surface that turned every wall into a marker board. Occupied offices had those walls filled with handwritten notes and numbers, each room feeling like its own deal lab. Rainwater's own desk had 2 phones, a yellow legal pad, a black felt tip marker, in a mysterious blue book. He'd take calls all day, filling the yellow pad black with notes, then tear it off, throw it away when he went home. Every day started fresh. Nobody was actually on payroll. Each person worked on deals that they brought in. They walked around the office for co-investment and earned through board fees and monitoring agreements when deals closed. Hearst described how it worked, saying, quote, "Richard used to say, go find partners, then walk the deal around the office and I'll take whatever's left." He also noticed the telltale sign that someone was ready to go independent. Quote, "I know when guys were ready to leave and strike out on their own because deals would only make it halfway through the floor or they wouldn't even get out of the guy's office before the entire equity check was spoken for." John Goff, who started as Rainwater's personal accountant at the Bass family office and joined Rainwater Inc. in 1986, described the environment saying, quote, "One day it would be Michael Milken. The next day it was Eisner, who was running Disney, or just about anyone." And then almost casually Goff added, "George W. Bush literally sat in my office for weeks while we worked on putting the Rangers deal together. This was before he was even governor." Rainwater was also doing deals at an extraordinary speed. One source captured the space saying, "He suddenly appears, asks the 5 most penetrating questions right away, and then disappears. A few minutes later, the deal's been done. I've never known anyone so biased towards quick action." The natural gas bet shows the mechanics at their most precise. In 1988, a McKinsey study showed that the deregulation of natural gas in 1986 had created a supply and demand imbalance. A price spike was inevitable by 1989 or 1990. A 25-year-old Stanford MBA named Ken Hirsch had spent the summer building the underlying data set. Rainwater cold called Gamble Baldwin, rated the #1 natural gas analyst in the country by Institutional Investor, and recruited him as the team's credibility anchor. Then he called Dick Jenrette at Equitable Life, reminded him that the Bass Investment LP had delivered exceptional returns, and told him it was time to go again. The terms here: Rainwater's group put up 2.5%, Equitable put up 97.5%. After an 11% preferred return, Rainwater's group takes 20% of the upside. Natural Gas Partners closed November 16, 1988. Equitable wired $97.5 million, and Rainwater's personal contribution to the founding was only $800,000. NGP eventually managed over $20 billion. The front page said natural gas was a disaster, and Rainwater read it as a floor. Another source illustrates the mental speed he brought to all of it. Quote, "Rainwater's capacity for absorbing figures is legendary. D. Dale Wood, former CEO of Crutcher Resources, will never forget the time that he met Rainwater. Wood wanted Rainwater to join him in buying a small pipeline equipment business. As Wood made his sales pitch, Rainwater kept taking calls on his speakerphone. Wood was beginning to simmer. Richard didn't seem to be paying attention, he recalls, but after a half hour, he summarized in 3 minutes everything I'd told him. He'd never even taken a note. The key insight here was that once Rainwater left the Basses, he proved that his real asset was judgment. The platform helped, but the transferable edge was how he structured broken situations." Chapter 6, Concentration, Healthcare, and Energy. The timeline here is from 1987 to 1990. By the late 1980s, Rainwater's worldview was fully formed. He wanted low prices, favorable terms, and financial leverage when it was justified, and a reason to believe that the operating improvement could unlock value. He also had very little interest in timid diversification.
Well, I think that textbook advice is good if you want to stay rich, but if you ever want to get rich, you have to be very concentrated. It's one of the things that I realized when I began investing. Most of the great fortunes were made by people who were invested generally in only one thing.
His first solo deal after leaving the Basses was Blocker Energy Corp. The offshore drilling market had collapsed. On July 9, 1986, the Los Angeles Times headline read, quote, "Oil falls below $11 a barrel. Blocker lost $140 million in 3 years and was drowning under more than $100 million in debt, with rigs scattered across the world that its lenders couldn't repossess without spending more than the rigs were worth." The Wall Street Journal was running the obituary. Rainwater read it as a term sheet. He proposed giving $12 million in cash to the banks holding Blocker's debt in exchange for 65% of the company's equity. The banks needed the liquidity. The rigs were scattered across Venezuela and other international locations. Seizing them would have cost the banks more than Rainwater was offering, so they accepted. His original plan was not to build an offshore driller. He wanted the operating loss carry forwards. The NOLs accumulated from years of losses to shelter profits from a separate profitable acquisition. He had even explored merging Blocker with VF Corporation, the owner of Wrangler Jeans, to shield Wrangler's profits from taxes. The law changed and killed that plan. Then on October 31st, 1986, one of Blocker's rigs in Venezuela exploded. Rainwater immediately called his lawyer. Was it insured? It was. When the deal closed December 11, 1986, the insurance company paid $13.4 million. Rainwater had recovered his entire $12 million investment plus a profit the day the ink dried. The cost to control 65% of this company was zero. He installed Carl Thorne, former president of Schlumberger's drilling and pipeline subsidiary, as CEO, gifted him shares so the alignment was total, and let Thorne build. Thorne bought offshore rigs at 10 to 25% of the original cost and began accumulating distressed competitors. Eventually, Thorne acquired Penrod, the Hunt family's offshore drilling fleet, which had borrowed $900 million to modernize its fleet and then collapsed when oil demand fell. The Hunts had spent $1.5 billion building Penrod. Rainwater and Ensco acquired it for $294 million. By 2007, on the 12th anniversary of Ensco's founding, assets had grown from $61 million to $4.5 billion. Revenue grew from $38.5 million to $1.8 billion. Net income from $3.3 million to $769 million. And the market cap hit $9 billion. Rainwater's 4.2% stake was worth $378 million, an 18% annual compounded return for 20 years from a $12 million investment that cost him nothing after the insurance check arrived. The healthcare story followed the same pattern, but on a larger scale. On September 1st, 1983, the New York Times front page read standard rates set for hospitals under Medicare. The government was capping reimbursements. Hospitals that operated on a blank check economics for 20 years now had to run like real businesses. The big four hospital chains, AMI, NME, Humana, and HCA, were struggling. Most investors were running. Rainwater went in for a learning position first. He bought an 8.7% stake in American Medical International in 1985, then raised it to 10.2% within 2 weeks. He took a board seat and observed from the inside while forming his thesis. He concluded that the existing operators were the wrong people for what came next. They'd built hospitals for the world of unlimited government reimbursement, and what was needed was someone who would run them like a business and who would give doctors ownership stakes, turning physicians from employees into partners, aligned with cost discipline. When Rainwater surveyed his network for the right operator, virtually every contact returned the same name, Rick Scott, a Dallas lawyer who had represented hospital companies in acquisitions. When he went to him in 1987 with his idea for a hospital company in which doctors invest in the facilities, Rick said something like, "Where have you been all of my life?" Rainwater and Scott each put up $125,000. They used that plus a $65 million Citibank loan to acquire 2 hospitals in El Paso, convincing 110 physicians to become equity partners. That structure became the blueprint. From 2 hospitals in 1988, Columbia grew to 190 nationwide by 1994. Revenue went from $45 million to $10.4 billion. Rainwater's $125,000 investment became $200 million in 7 years. At the same time, Thomas Frist Jr. at HCA needed credibility to execute a management-led buyout. The banks wouldn't commit without a name they trusted, so Frist called Rainwater. Rainwater participated with $25 million in equity. That position became $480 million when HCA went public, again 4 years later. JP Morgan's $65 million investment in the same deal became $1.2 billion. Total healthcare investment from Rainwater was roughly $25 million. His total return was $680 million within 7 years. A profile captured the macro mood he preferred. Quote, "These days, Rainwater seems gloomy times ahead for the economy." He goes down the list of American woes: a credit crunch in real estate, crisis in the savings and loan industry, losses to foreign competition, and so on. "We've been protected from a lot of this so far," he says, "but it's about to get a lot more personal." So Rainwater is hoarding cash in investing in sectors he thinks are depression-proof, such as healthcare. The key insight here is that Rainwater's major wins came from concentrated conviction in stressed sectors with patience to wait until the terms were unmistakably in his favor. Chapter 7. Crescent and the trust trade. The timeline here is from 1990 to 1994. The early 1990s were almost tailor-made for Rainwater. Texas real estate was still bruised, capital was scarce, and good assets were trapped inside bad balance sheets. The Crescent deal illustrates the structure at its most precise. Caroline Rose Hunt of the Hunt oil family had borrowed heavily against a portfolio of premium office buildings in Texas with a personal guarantee on the debt. When Texas commercial real estate collapsed, she was facing the loss of personal assets, and she needed a lifeline. Rainwater offered to buy the portfolio at roughly 10 cents on the dollar using a seller's note, putting essentially no cash down himself. She would retain a small equity slice in the upside. His internal framing of this type of deal was, quote, "Heads I win, tails I win even more." He was working from a position where the seller had no other options. This was his version of the 2 and 80 rather than a 2 and 20. Instead of a standard fee structure, he structured deals where he could keep 80% of the upside, giving partners or sellers 20%. The best deals attracted capital on any terms. Institutional partners either joined or they got left out, and they never wanted to be left out. A profile of Crescent states the method with admirable precision. Quote, "The Rainwater approach to investing is straightforward. Identify business that's out of favor, apply shrewd financing techniques, hire talented managers to run it, and wait for the market to rebound. But real estate, while hardly booming, is not flat on its back either. So Rainwater won't be buying at the bottom of the market prices." Rainwater admits he's a few years late, but argues there's still plenty of gems out there. The partnership with John Goff shows how seriously he took alignment. Goff pitched Crescent to Rainwater on one page of a yellow legal pad, which was exactly the format Rainwater preferred. Rainwater's response was immediate. Quote, "I love it. You put up your entire net worth." The original money behind it came from Fort Worth investor Richard Rainwater, who made a fortune for the Bass brothers, and then for himself by betting on Texaco, Disney, and Nabisco when they were out of favor. Goff, now 47, had worked as an investment advisor for Rainwater since the late 1980s. In 1990, they teamed up to form Crescent. Goff chipped in all the money he had, $8 million. And Rainwater put in $110 million. That line, Goff chipped in all the money he had, tells you everything you need to know about Rainwater standards. He wanted partners who were exposed. He wanted operators who felt the pressure in the same way he did. Ownership, in his world, was how seriousness became visible. Before Crescent, Rainwater had also spent time advising Roger Staubach on his real estate business. He counseled Staubach to separate the leasing operation from the property ownership business. Recognizing that Staubach was exceptional at leasing office space to major corporations, but that the two activities had different risk profiles. That relationship gave Rainwater a granular understanding of Texas commercial real estate cycles before he went large with Crescent. Crescent Real Estate Equities was eventually sold to Morgan Stanley in 2007 for $7 billion. The key insight here, Crescent showed that Rainwater had reached a new level. He was no longer underwriting only assets. He was underwriting operators, structures, and eventually his own reputation.
Chapter 8, The Mature Style. The timeline here is from 1994 to 1999.
By the mid-1990s, Rainwater's style was recognizable, even though the admiration and caution often appeared in the same sentence. One magazine profile from the Bass Orbit helps explain the mature version of that style. Quote, "For the rest of the decade, the Bass brothers, with Richard Rainwater as the frontman, backed money managers, venture capitalists, oilmen, and others who had great track records. Each time they were very generous in giving equity to their partners. As the quality of the people they bet on improved, their results also improved. By 1980, the Basses and the Rainwater had made progression from being rich to enormously rich. He was willing to look wrong for a while if the structure of the bet was right. That quality made him especially effective in stressed sectors where public controversy and financing pressures could create create huge spreads between sentiment and reality. This was also the period when Darla Moore, who had famously told, quote, "I view you like an equity investment," when they first met, took on a larger operational role at Rainwater Inc. One profile described the impact saying, quote, "Darla Moore fell hard for Richard Rainwater. The moment he told her, quote, 'I view you like an equity investment,' it was the ultimate compliment," says Moore, a woman who believes that business and love are similar games. She was the highest paid woman in banking. He was renowned as one of America's most ingenious investors. Since they merged matrimonially, Moore had taken charge of Rainwater's stock portfolio as well as his life. Moore grew Rainwater Inc. from $500 million to $1.5 billion in roughly 3.5 years as its operating head. One of her most consequential moves was acquiring Mesa Inc., T. Boone Pickens' own natural gas company, and then pushing Pickens out. Pickens had built a reputation as a champion of shareholder value while simultaneously extracting from Mesa in ways that hurt his own shareholders. Rainwater and Moore, working alongside Ken Hirsch's NGP, took control and restructured it. Mesa eventually became Pioneer Natural Resources. Pioneer was sold to ExxonMobil in October 2023 for $60 billion, a direct Rainwater legacy company, generating historic returns nearly a decade after his death. John Goff captured the discipline behind the whole era with a finding that came from an internal audit. Quote, "Richard Rainwater and we hired a firm to come in and audit our results. What we found is that 80% of the profits came out of 20% of the investments. All these little things were big distractions. He was perfectly willing to wait. He did not need to be constantly active. He needed conditions that made sense." One direct quote from that period was, "Right now, I'm not in the stock market. I'm very uncomfortable. I can't find low prices and financial leverage. Earlier in the year, I bought natural gas stocks, but right now I'm holding them. I'm starting to look at the insurance industry, specifically the catastrophe end of the business. It's currently undergoing fundamental changes. This will force more and more companies to price their policies more aggressively." The key insight here was that Rainwater's mature style combined hard pricing with deep respect for talent. He won big by pairing severe discipline on terms with unusually strong operator alignment. Chapter 9, Compounding Through People. The timeline here is from 2000 to 2010. As Rainwater moved into the 2000s, the story widened. The major deals still mattered. What mattered just as much was the network of people he had influenced, financed, mentored, and emboldened. The full roster of what has been called the Rainwater Mafia is staggering. David Bonderman, who found TPG, Barry Sternlicht, who found Starwood Capital, Eddie Lampert, who built ESL Investments, Gerald Haddock, who ran Crescent, John Phelan, who built MSD Partners, John Goff, who ran Crescent, and Ken Hirsch, who built NGP. Roger Staubach, who built the Staubach Company, Al Chechi, who built Northwest Airlines, Bill Obernorf, who found SPO Partners, Dan Stern, who started Reservoir Capital, Barry Volpert, who built Crestview Partners, and more. Others who ran through the Bass Brothers orbit included Jim Coulter, who founded TPG, Tom Barrick, who built Colony Capital, Mark Lasry, who started Avenue Capital, John Graykin, who built Lone Star Funds. Almost none of them were paid by Rainwater. They were given a desk, access to deal flow, and a sink or swim mandate. Barry Sternlicht interned for Rainwater in Fort Worth before founding Starwood Capital. Rainwater offered him the same deal he offered everyone else: a desk, access, and no salary. Sternlicht decided he couldn't work for free and he left. He started Starwood Capital instead. David Bonderman's path into TPG runs directly through Rainwater's office. When the Bass family split their assets and Robert Bass needed his own capital allocator, Robert hired Bonderman. Robert sent Bonderman to Rainwater's office to learn how he worked. Rainwater told him, "Just sit in and watch." Bonderman learned that Rainwater didn't look at spreadsheets or memos. The idea had to be so simple that you could pencil it out in 6 lines on the back of an envelope. If you needed computer programs, forget it. That is the intellectual DNA of TPG. The George W. Bush story belongs in this chapter too. Rainwater had backed Bush's early oil company, Arbusto Energy, through the Bass family in the 1970s. Then when Bush was looking to acquire the Texas Rangers, Rainwater backed that as well. Goff describes Bush sitting in his office for weeks working through the deal structure before he was even thinking seriously about politics. The Rangers succeeded. Nolan Ryan anchored the roster. The team started winning. Bush used that visibility to run for governor. He won, and the rest is history. As Rami Adi, the historian who spent years researching Rainwater's career, put it, if it wasn't for Rainwater, the 43rd president might still be sitting in Midland. Rainwater also influenced a generation of investors through direct mentorship at Harvard Business School. One of the most famous stories involves a 25-year-old named Bill Ackman who stood in line to talk to Rainwater after visiting his class, invited him to lunch, and asked whether it was stupid to start his own fund right out of school. Rainwater replied saying, quote, "You don't have to be old to be right." That was all Ackman needed. He went on to found Pershing Square Capital Management. He also had a distinctive philosophy about scenario analysis. His Stanford classmates remember him saying,
"You have to look at scenarios A through Z, and most people only will look at the middle to most probable outcomes. You got to focus on, as he says, friggin' Z. Z is the one where it's the big returns."
And there's this quote, one of the most personal, about what it felt like to act when others were frozen. Quote, "I would sit there looking at all these industries and realize that other people were seeing the same thing, but they were frozen. People with the same level of knowledge, used to the industry, with chaos raining down on them, being crushed or frozen. After they had spent years being wrecked, they became despondent and didn't want to leave the office. I would arrive with an idea, and sometimes they didn't want to, or sometimes they would be opposed to it. But once I've determined what to do, I go forward. I fight despair with facts and overcome greed by being generous." The key insight here is that Rainwater's later influence compounded through people. His greatest long-tail advantage may have been his ability to spot talent, strengthen conviction, and bind both to ownership. Chapter 10, Final Perspective. The timeline here is from 2010 to 2015 and beyond. Rainwater's final years were shaped by illness. He was diagnosed with progressive supranuclear palsy, a rare degenerative brain disease, and wrote publicly about it in Fortune magazine to raise awareness of a condition most people had never heard of. He died in 2015 at the age of 71. What matters more is what remains. By the end of his life, the core pattern of his career was visible across industry after industry. He looked for sectors under strain. He did his work. He found the operator. He structured the deal so that the odds approved before the first year of execution even began. One source gives the most compact summary of the pattern, saying, quote, "Rainwater would identify big industry-wide problems, go about doing his own internal research to quickly find a solution he found suitable as an investment thesis. He would then recruit the best in the industry who can execute on that vision, and then would sell the deal to eager investors who wanted to be part of the ride. He did this with Rick Scott when they formed Columbia HCA, John Goff with Crescent Real Estate, Ken Hirsch with NGP Capital, and most famously Eddie Lampert with ESL Partners. When asked about his estate, he was direct. He had been asked on television, quote, "You've got 600 to 700 million. What's going to happen to it?" He replied, "The way the estate is currently configured, 100% of it goes to charity. The kids have been taken care of, but they were taken care of the right way. They actually took risks with me." That phrase, "they took risks with me," is pure Rainwater. He gave his children the same deal he gave everyone else. Near the end of his life, when his Stanford class was honoring him with an award, a classmate said something that works as the final word on how he moved through the world. Richard had never sought self-recognition. For the balance of his career, nobody knew who Richard Rainwater was. Richard should have received this award 20 years ago, and 15 years ago, and 10 years ago. But every time any of us proposed it, he would always say, "No, there's someone else who's more deserving. I haven't done that much." Yet there's also the moral language he used to explain why the work mattered.
I saw what the capitalist system was. I fell in love with it. I'm still in love with it today. I think it's the greatest thing that we've contributed to the rest of the world.
But that's all abstract.
No, see, I don't believe it's abstract. I believe it's real. I believe fixing a Disney and having Disney help it become what it is today is a wonderful thing to do.
And then there's the reflection on his own gifts.
I think that what I've been able to actually accomplish at the level that I'm able to accomplish is a gift that I can't explain. I would say to you that if you look at maybe what Michael Jordan has done in basketball, he had some additional gifts on the court with other professional players that could not be explained. It wasn't because he tied his shoes differently or what he had for breakfast or dinner. He just somehow was blessed with some additional insights.
So when we return to the line from the opening, it lands differently. Quote, "You don't know anything. That's your superpower. Start with a blank page and ask, where must money go and how can I help?" By the end of the story, that line no longer sounds like a clever slogan. It sounds like the operating system. It is how Rainwater kept himself from inheriting other people's assumptions. It is how he found room to think clearly when others were trapped inside fear, prestige, or consensus. The key insight here, what survived Rainwater was a way of seeing. He traded panic as information, people as force multipliers, and structure as the hidden engine of exceptional returns. Richard Rainwater never became the most publicly famous titan of his era. In some ways, that is exactly why his story feels so fresh. He moved through the center of American finance for decades without needing the broad celebrity that attached itself to most of his peers. He let the deals speak. He let the structure speak. And when the timing was right, he let the terms do the heavy lifting. Pioneer Natural Resources, a company whose lineage runs directly through Rainwater, sold to ExxonMobil in 2023 for $60 billion. Crescent sold to Morgan Stanley in 2007 for $7 billion. Ensco became a $9 billion offshore drilling company. Columbia became the largest hospital chain in the country. NGP grew to $20 billion under management. These are the outcomes of his operator selections, still compounding long after he was gone. That made him a fitting subject for this series. He sits at the intersection of capital, psychology, narrative, and power. He reminds us that many of the biggest fortunes are not built by people who shout the loudest, they are built by the people who can keep thinking when everyone else starts reacting. For founders, CEOs, and finance professionals, that may be the most durable lesson in the whole story. The market eventually teaches everyone the numbers. The rare skill is learning how to read the situation before the crowd agrees on what it means. That was Rainwater's edge, and that is why he still matters. One more thing. This film took 7 people weeks to create. Our goal is to produce content like this every single week. Netflix production on the greatest stories in finance and business. And if you want to see more of this, like the video, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. That's how we keep this going.